it's a little surprise then that few Americans see this story as more than a saga for African Americans. We have allowed, through the work that we often do in museums, slavery not to become marginalized, but slavery not to be given the central focus that it deserves. Museums often treat slavery, unfortunately, as an ancillary or exotic story, something that a visitor experiences on the way to another museum, on the way to another exhibition. And let me give you the best example. I was in a museum, a state museum in the South 3 weeks ago, and I asked the director, I said, let's talk to me about how you're interpreting slavery. And he walked me through his exhibitions, and he said, we really position slavery in such a way that the public will go through it, but we want them to see that the story of our state is more than the story of slavery. This was a museum director not more than 3 weeks ago. I would suggest that it is incumbent on our cultural institutions to reposition the discourse so that slavery is seen as a monumental story to all Americans. I would suggest that the second challenge that museums have is the challenge of creating a much more dynamic portrait of slavery. There's the array of amazingly good recent scholarship that examines the dynamic and fluid nature of the institution of slavery. Scholarship that helps us better understand that slavery was not static and that chronological and regional considerations contributed to a very diverse and changing institution. Yet rarely do museums capture more than a frozen moment. At the National Museum of American History, let me criticize some of my own work. The show that we did on slavery in the 19th century really does capture a wonderful moment in mid-19th century Charleston. But we realized later how much is left out of the conversation we want the public to have. There is nothing to help the visitor understand how plantation life in the 18th century differed from plantation life in the 19th century. There's little to help the visitor understand the relationship between urban slavery and plantation slavery. And there is little attempt to explore the differing slave experiences on rice and sugar and cotton plantations. The static nature of the museum exhibition, of the medium of exhibitions, also limits the public's understanding, I would argue, of the interdependence and interrelations that were essential to slavery. Few exhibitions explore the interconnectivity among those that were free and those that were enslaved. It is clear that people married, fought, collaborated, worked across many lines, and yet that interdependence is not often seen in many of our museum exhibitions. And I would suggest that in some ways, we even fail to show how the interdependence among black and white in many of our museums. When you go to African American museums in the country, what's been interesting to me is you can go through most of the African American museums that explore the question of slavery and not see any white imagery, any white figures in these institutions. So as if the story of slavery is simply an African American story. This question of how we move museum exhibitions so that they can convey the complexity that the public needs is one of the great challenges we have. So that the black experience, the experience of slavery, is seen in some ways as a shared experience. One way, I think, to begin to wrestle with this question is to foster a sense of collaboration amongst these institutions outside of their regions. While there have been wonderful exhibitions, the show that John Blatch and others worked on for the Museum of the Confederacy, exhibitions that have traveled around the country, there are a few opportunities to bring together differing perspectives of slavery so that you have institutions from Louisiana and North Carolina working together to craft exhibitions that allow the public to see a more diverse, a more richer experience. I would argue that one of the goals, I would hope, of a national museum is to stimulate that kind of collaboration, that kind of relationship that allows us really to bring what has always been a local story and make it national for the public. I would suggest to you that the third challenge is the challenge of nationalizing slavery. I think that with some rare examples, like the recent work at the New York Historical Society, much of the work on slavery has really focused on the antebellum South. It's really been a 19th century story. And in some ways, while that is an important part of the way to understand notions of resistance and independence and liberty, it is a much narrow part of what the public really needs. I would suggest to you that part of my excitement about the New York State Historical Society work is that it really does both help the public begin to see slavery from a very different lens, a northern lens, but it also allows people to see slavery as central to the identity of a place like New York City. I think in some ways there's been a lot of really interesting work done by Gretchen Soren, who's up at the Cooperstown Graduate Program. She has really worked in the field. She has worked in small historical societies, in county museums, and has begun to help them craft exhibitions that look at slavery throughout the North. And of course, the work of the African Burial Ground really does reposition slavery as a national story and not just a Southern story. But it seems to me what is really important is that we need to find ways to build upon that wonderful work that went on before, because slavery really is a crucial lens into understanding what it means to be an American, not just what it means to be a Southern American. For me, the fourth challenge that museums grapple with is really the challenge of globalization. You know, we have all heard the phrase, think globally and act locally. Well, I would suggest that American museums always think locally and act locally, especially when it comes to the interpretation of slavery. With the exception, often, of a wonderfully bad map of the Triangle of Trade. I didn't say which museums. What you often see is really a little understanding of how this is connected in a global sense, in a global setting. American museums rarely grapple with the international or global dimensions of this. And yet, in some ways, slavery is this wonderful lens to explore broad global issues of race and identity, of trade and power and commerce. But it's a lens that is closed to most of our visitors. What better subject than slavery to help the Americans rethink their place, their role in a global economy? What better subject than slavery to allow Americans to break down the parochialism that shapes our lives on a daily basis? And more importantly, we do the American public a disservice when we don't help them see that the origins, the evolution, and legacy of slavery is really tied to the international dimension. But this tendency to look inward really also limits America's museum's ability to benefit from the work that's going on globally. I mean, I think one of the great joys of this conference is bringing together people from around the world. But I would suggest to you that the wonderful work on slavery that has gone on in Liverpool or Lyon and Amsterdam and many other places offer models of how we can explore slavery in different ways, and often models as the central story in the national discourse. I am especially drawn by the work in Liverpool. I think Tony is here and several others from Liverpool that really has demonstrated how Liverpool's identity is profoundly shaped by its involvement with the slave trade. But what I came away with more than that were in the meetings that I would have in Liverpool and meet with members of the black community of Liverpool, there was this real sense that this was an opportunity not to just talk about the past, but to talk about the present. And there was a real embrace of the National Museums in Liverpool because of that opportunity. In some ways, what they've done in Liverpool has really encouraged the difficult but important reassessment of England's role and responsibility towards the slave trade. Equally important, it seems to me, that the kinds of collaborative work that is going on in the West Indies, going on in Africa, are also not good examples of what we can do. I've always been struck by the way parts of the West Indies and parts of the UK and parts of France have embraced the UNESCO call for a Slavery Remembrance Day. Something as simple as that becomes crucially important. And the other day, one of the joys of running this museum is that you end up spending a lot of time with a lot of people on many different levels, many different political levels. But one of the things that's been is a discussion about what should there be? Should there be a Slavery Remembrance Day in the United States? And if so, what does it mean? How would it work out? So I'm really, really touched by the way this UNESCO call has been answered in some countries. I think the fifth challenge is the challenge of balancing public expectations and scholarly interpretations. Often the interpretation of slavery in American museums smooths the rough edges of historical debate. After all, it is difficult to balance the desire to explore a complicated, painful, and difficult story with the public's need to find heroes and unambiguous closure. Often, institutions make sure that stories of Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass or their local equivalents are central to their interpretation. Yet I would suggest that we often underestimate both the public's understanding, interest, and sophistication when it comes to slavery. Our goal ought to be to help the public find the heroism that is in the strength, resiliency, creativity, and optimism of the slave. But our goal ought to also be to help the public realize that there is, to use David's word, there is tragedy, there is loss, there is disappointment. In some ways, those storylines are outside of the narrative that many museums create. It is even more important, I would argue, that the public needs to embrace the nameless men and women who rose every day and vowed that the field would not break them. Those who struggled to keep their families together, their culture alive, and their humanity are the people that museums often forget to talk about. American museums, in some way, must be really wary of the narratives they present to their audience, because far too often the narrative celebrates the exceptional rather than recognizing that under slavery, the ordinary was the exception. While audiences often find greater comfort on those who struck the blow or on whose presence as free men and women call into question the whole underpinnings of slavery, we must remember to give equal voice, equal vision to those who remained in bondage. We must give name and life and face to the enslaved, because often many museums do what slavery could not. They strip the enslaved of their humanity and of their individuality. Part of what makes this, I think, so important and so challenging is that the interpretation of slavery is also formed by, in some ways, a narrative of inevitability. When you go into these museums, it's as if we knew that freedom would come, as if we knew that just patience and resiliency would lead to change. Yet I would argue that we undervalue this resiliency, this creativity of the enslaved, because they found ways to believe in an environment when there was little evidence that freedom would eventually be won. I would also argue that one of the great challenges we face in museums is the challenge of finding the contemporary resonance of slavery. As David said, often museums struggle to find ways to connect slavery with a variety of audiences. Part of that struggle is to find the contemporary link, the contemporary resonance. It was made clear to me this week when I was in London. As you know, in the UK, 2007 is the bicentennial of the abolition of the slave trade, and there's an awful lot of discussion about what should happen. So I met with an array of museum directors, I met with museum directors in the morning, and they talked about how the National Portrait Gallery was going to make a trail of abolitionism that you could go through their exhibitions, or the Museum of Empire and Commonwealth in Bristol is going to make a major exhibition on the history of slavery in the UK. But there was also, even more interesting to me, what would happen in the afternoon. Because in the afternoon, I would meet with, quote, community representatives from the black community, which meant from the Asian community and from the African, from the Caribbean community. And what was so interesting in those discussions was the simple fact that they saw 2007 as something that had to be transformed. They saw 2007 as more about today and tomorrow than it was about yesterday. And yet most of the museum directors were talking about yesterday. And there was a great frustration when one of the parents said to me, it is really important that we find ways to engage our youth on these questions. Because for them, it is both an opportunity to understand one's past. It is also an opportunity to find ways to turn slavery in the minds of many youth as a story of defeat, to a story of resiliency. That word resiliency was used over and over and over again as I met with community groups. In some ways, they began to ask the question, well, is 07 really a story of how England pats itself on the back for its involvement with the end of the slave trade? Or is it really a story that illuminates the crisis and the challenge of race in the UK? So I went back to the museum directors at my final day and I said, let's talk about how this would work. No museum director had an answer of how they wanted to help the public grapple with the contemporary resonance of slavery. Yet I would argue to you, that is one of the great challenges one has to make those connections. Because the challenge is really, how do you craft a realistic understanding of the slave experience? How do you let people get the resiliency they need, but to get the stories, the history that they deserve? I was struck that in some ways, we in our museums must find ways to make explicit why these stories should have meaning for our publics. One person said to me, I can go through an exhibition and I can find meaning, but it might help if you guys do a little bit more and help me find that meaning as well. So ultimately, it seems to me, museums, be they in the UK or here, must find ways to use slavery as a kind of mirror, a wonderfully unforgiving mirror that illuminates the construction of American identity. And as museums, from local to regional to national institutions, struggle to frame local identity, I would love to see slavery used as that lens. I would love to see what happens in parts of the slavery show in New York, allowing people to understand that the story of South Carolina has to be seen through this lens of slavery, the story of Tennessee, or the national story as well. That in essence, slavery is the entry point into understanding our national, our regional identity. In some ways, Let me conclude with a quotation that means so much to me. Cornelius Holmes was someone who was interviewed during the WPA, and in 1939 he was asked, why should slavery be remembered? And he said, though the slavery question is settled, its past is not. The question will be with us always. It is in our politics, it is in our courts, it is on our highways, it is in our manner, and it is in our religion. And it is in our thoughts all the day, every day. All the day, every day. What a great gift American museums could give the public if they could help Americans remember that we are still touched by slavery all the day, every day. Thank you.
For the selection of the site for the museum in Washington, I had written my congressman, and I was struck by the fact that the site that was selected is absolutely dead center on the mall. And I was wondering if you had ambivalent feelings about that selection being central like that it might be impetus for people to believe that the rejected stone is then finally in place, and that people might begin to look at it as a closure of the issue.
Well, being from New Jersey, I'd rather be on the mall, be in the center of the game than anywhere. I think the issue is really, how does the public come to this museum? There are thousands of people who see this museum as the culmination of the civil rights movement. I've had many people come to me and say, we've waited so long, this is really our moment. And I think that's important. I think, however, the other side, and what the mall site gives you, is the opportunity to make sure you frame African American history as the best lens into what it means to be an American. Because I think that, whether you call it sacred space, you're going to get millions of visitors a year. And one of the things that I think is wonderful about the Smithsonian is that, if you get 5 million visitors, only 2 million really care about your subject matter, whatever the subject is. Most of them are trying to get out of the sun. So the question really is, how do you craft a museum that engages all of those folks? And I think this notion of using it to help people understand how this is a way to frame American national identity is part of it. But the long and the short of it is, the success of the museum is now assured by winning a site on the mall. Yes, sir.
Is this wonderful talk being recorded, and will it be available to us?
The video.
Good.
And we'll leave it on the website if you approve.
Yes, sir.
I have a question about the anniversary of the abolition of slavery is written, and not only how it focuses on the contemporary part of history, but are we really telling me?
I'll let those who are from the UK have that conversation on and on.
But a whole session.
But I do think what is important is that your framing it really gets at how contentious this is. I couldn't believe in one of my lectures at the UK, I happened to just mention Wilberforce. Just mention it. Oh man. And so I think that there are it's all loaded with this baggage about, is this a moment for the UK to celebrate what it does? And I met with one of the Lord Mayors of some town, I can't remember which one now, and he talked about the squadrons that stopped slavery. And he said, what I want to make sure we do is create monuments to those squadrons. So it really is this wonderful moment. If it's used correctly, it's a wonderful moment to get at those divisions within the UK. The challenge is that how do you coordinate that so that you really do have a national dialogue?
I just have to make one other point, and that is the fact that the British slave owners and slave traders were given reparations, 22 million pounds, at the end of the slave trade, and not a dime is given to the slave or no plantation. So they really don't care about the slave. It was more about continuing the economy in England because of the losses that these slave owners and slave traders and slave financiers were going to lose as a result of England taking that position.
I think the second most asked question I received in the UK is, would this museum that I'm leading facilitate reparations in the United States? That was the number one question. Number two question. Number one was, do I know Oprah Winfrey? Yes, ma'am.
I'd be curious to hear if you could elaborate on it a minute. When you're talking about the contemporary resonance of slavery, and feeling it's incumbent upon public institutions to be explicit, do you have, sort of in your own head, an immediate kind of list of the resonance, what those specifics are regarding slavery of the past and contemporary life today? Or can you tell me where I'm going to find them?
Well, I think there are a couple things. I mean, and part of this is really difficult because of the balance we're trying to find, the right tensions. But I think that part of what I've been struck by as I travel around the country and talk to people about slavery is trying to find what is that hook that says, I understand why this is important to me. And some of that is really tied to simply saying in an explicit way, which we don't say in all our museums, that what the slave trade, what slavery led to economically, what it meant for the country writ large, how that led to certain things that help define who we are today. The second thing that people have always asked me about is, how can we find, it's that notion of how do you find optimism and resiliency from the story of slavery. And so there's a lot of push of saying, help me define for my children or for myself that we could sort of, there's this wonderful quotation I always use about, you know, the notion that slaves were bought, but they were also brave. And so I think people want some of that to be able to take a positive notion, a notion of resiliency out of the slave experience. I think the challenge is for us to wrestle with this, to figure out how we do it, but I think it's crucially important that we do that.
No, I agree with you. I'm sort of just thinking about, and I personally characterize it as kind of white denial, to say that slavery of the past does not have specific impact on me today. And as an educator, I'm feeling strongly that it does. I'm looking for the language to respond to it. And hopefully your museum will do that.
Jim?
No, I mean, I was just gonna speak to that, to say, you wanna know how slavery affects you today, the way we think about race comes from the way.
But I think that Jim's.
Then you have movies, you have pictures, you have facsimiles. The virtue of museums is that you can get back to connections to fill up your big new house on.
I'm going to do just what the British did, steal it from everywhere. I think that in some ways, okay, let me be serious, because I'll get a call from Congress.
Cut the tape.
Too late. I think that part of the notion is to create an interesting partnership, a kind of national Save Our African American Treasures. I would argue that the 20th century and some of the 19th century is in people's homes. It is still in the garages, in the attics, in the basement. So what we want to do is create this major initiative that says we will come into cities, and the goal is not so much what we collect, but what we preserve. So that we will work with local institutions to help people preserve things in their homes. Then what we will do is stimulate giving at the local museum. So we go to Chicago. I want you to give most of whatever we find to the DeSable Museum or the Chicago Historical Society. Then a small percentage might come back to Washington. So that in essence, the real challenge for a national museum today is to be a place of collaboration. And so I think by framing it through that lens, that'll help us build some of the collections. The other issue is sort of thinking about the politics of this. There are an array of collectors, many African Americans, but those collections are almost one generation old. They're new. They don't want to be given away yet. So part of the issue is obviously to build for the future, but to, for example, you go to a collector of African American art, and instead of saying, Mr. Cosby, I want your whole collection, of course I would turn it down, you say, I need 4 or 5 pieces. And therefore it allows you to begin to build the collections in a way that makes sure this will be a place of things. I mean, I think that what's important is trying to figure out in the 21st century what are the role of objects. And what we've always said at the museum is, once you're on the mall, it means that you are competing with the rest of the Smithsonian, which means that, you know, I'm going to go see the Wright Flyer, I'm going to see the Greensboro lunch counter, and so I think the challenge for this museum is it cannot simply be a place that is ripe with technology. We have to find the tension between pieces of the true cross, new technologies, and new collaborations. Richard.
Lonnie, tactically, I want to see how we can move from your talk, which I think is a really wonderful compendium of ideas about this, but you're preaching to the choir in a way. And as you describe this British meeting, I'm intrigued because I can't imagine such a meeting occurring in the United States at this stage. How do we move from here, generosity of the Gilder LEHRMAN Center, to a situation where the people who work in the process, the intellectual process, that moves more people to this kind of understanding? I'm wondering, and that's a job that's twice as large as the one we've already done. So I'm wondering what your museum can do, or what you can help foster in all these other.
The issue you raised is part of the thinking of what a 21st century museum, national museum, needs to do. The Smithsonian.
You gave a wonderful dealing with the political issues that Dave raised earlier, and how do you intend to protect that vision so that we have the reality of what you're proposing?
I think that you do several things. First of all, you make sure you create the kind of national, almost membership campaign that allows you to say, I've got 10,000 people in Chicago, and 5,000 people in Houston, and 10,000 people in LA, because this is a game of being able to say, this is why this should matter to you, Congressman X or Senator Y. The other way you protect yourself is what we learned at the Smithsonian after the Enola Gay. The way to protect yourself in Congress is to make sure that you've got 35 members of Congress who will stand up and say, you're right, when somebody else says you're wrong. What you want is that draw. That's what you want. So what we've been doing is building our angels, our net of people who are willing to sort of stand up and say this is right. The other thing that's interesting, though, and you mentioned some of the people who are more conservative who support this. I mean, it's very interesting. The notion was that issues of race, especially African American culture, is controversial, but yet it's something that many of the conservative Republicans are more comfortable with, which has been really interesting to me. We've talked a lot about that. And the other part of trying to survive in the 20th century. So I think there's a much more sophisticated way we will try to do these things. And also, I don't like to lose, so I think
We'll take one more, I think. Maybe 2 if they're quick.
I'm curious whether you see January 1st of 2008, the bicentennial of abolition of the trade in the U.S. as an opportunity, what you know of that's going on around that, and it's, to me, it's interesting because it doesn't have the potential to be as triumphalistic a story as in England, because there wasn't the big social movement. It was a result of the constitutional deferment of the issue. But that also means, because of the lack of social movement supposedly behind it, that there's not as much awareness of the date. So it's not a date that is in the public consciousness. Do you think we should make it that, and can we use it as an opportunity to do the kinds of things that Richard is talking about?
I would argue very strongly that 2008 gives us some great possibilities. I've already been talking to many people on the Hill about getting support for a kind of national initiative around 2008 to obviously
Lonnie, I just wanted to ask you a question about the challenge of public institutions to meet your challenges. With a limited time frame for people to visit museums, 45 minutes to a couple of hours, the role of public historians, is it in meeting these challenges to introduce the public to this story or to summarize about this story within that limited time frame? Do we whet their appetite with an introduction and leave them? Or do we try to encompass as briefly as possible this huge, big, hairy, integrated story of enslavement in America and the world?
I would argue that in some ways we do what museums do best, which is use all the tools at their disposal and really make a concerted effort through the public program, through our websites, through the exhibitions. I would suggest that often we are satisfied in museums with giving the public simple answers to complex questions. I think we shouldn't do that anymore. If that means we have to delve more deeply, be more sophisticated and smarter in how we do these things, then so be it. I think this is too important an opportunity to miss.